Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Professor Pao, for introducing me. Thank you for a beautiful beginning. Everybody, Anna, Paige, even Alice, I think it was a very well put together research. I'm really looking forward to discussing more with you. I am here to discuss about the New York Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act. I want to talk about the single piece of legislation that can do so much more in the realm of accountability in the fashion industry to make it a more sustainable place than anything else at this point. I feel like the stage is set beautifully by Paige, Anna, and Alice for us to discuss this topic, as we have heard countless instances, even in the plenary sessions, of how the fashion industry has been making negative climate impacts for years on end now. At best, it's a murky one. And according to a research conducted by Ellen MacArthur Foundation, if the fashion industry does not correct its course, right now, it will be responsible for more than 26% of the world's global carbon budget by 2020. So one way of steering away from reaching the catastrophic potential is to move away from the current linear model, which has been emphasized since morning, and a wasteful textile system that we are in right now to a more circular textile economy. But this transition from the linear to the circular economy is not possible in isolation. I'm here to make the case that the fashion industry in its current form has largely been bereft of regulation in almost all countries until recently, which has led to the genesis of fast fashion and also the genesis of blatant disregard for the environment. I have endeavored here to explore the complex question of whether there is a need for harmonization of the international regulatory framework in the fashion industry for ensuring innovation in a way that it reduces negative climate as well as social impact. While the slow movement has created a steadily increasing number of conscious consumers, it has failed to diminish the negative climate impact of the industry. The same can be said about the industry-wide efforts that have been made to adopt more sustainable practices, which have largely been inconsistent and not really concerted. So it has resulted in burdening some companies much, much more than the others in the industry. My research suggests that our emphasis for now must be to recognize the need for the industry-wide legally binding regulation and environmental standards enacted through the government legislations globally. And thus need is what needs to be, the legislations are what needs to be harmonized in order for the industry to implement them efficiently. Regulations historically are met with resistance, and this is largely because initially they seem like they only restrict or levy fines or approve the existing systems and processes that everyone has become comfortable with. But on a closer look, one would understand that regulations will actually lift the pressure off of the industry as well as the consumers in a really, really big way. As enormous as this change seems right now, if drafted well, laws will supplement the industry in ways that will work in the favor in the long run. They will also give a clearer picture of what more the brands can do and what more the brands can ask for from their respective governments in their efforts to adopt a better way of doing business. I would like to briefly take you through the reasons for why we need to prioritize accountability on part of the governments and lobby for direct regulations more than anything else to achieve the intended industry-wide transformation. I've taken an interdisciplinary approach to address this issue. I've carried out an exploratory research that analyzes the revolution that the proposed Fashion Act spearheads in terms of accountability in the fashion industry. I would also like to mention here that as a South Asian IP and tech attorney living in Mumbai, which is the epicenter of Indian fashion, with a law practice predominantly stretching between the US and India, I believe that I'm situated in a position today to see the divide between the global north and the global south in stark contrast with each other in practice on a daily basis. For a long time now, it is not a secret that the global north has sent the fast fashion textile waste to the global south, which was enumerated beautifully in the session before mine. Specifically in countries like Bangladesh, which are situated in the Indian subcontinent. I feel very strongly about the need at the moment for the shift in the neo-colonial approach that the global north has consciously or unconsciously held towards the global south for years now. In the same way, I also believe that the changes brought about in the global north, like the Fashion Act that we are going to discuss today, will have a very positive trickle down impact on the global south, which is essential to overhaul the global practices of the industry at large. Further, it is important that we define today what we mean by accountability. Accountability for the scope of my research is the act of taking responsibility to reduce the negative climate and social impact from the fashion industry. There are three main limbs of the industry that I'm considering that we're factoring in for the research, and they are the consumers, the companies, which are the brands and retailers, and the government. Each segment has been seen taking cognizance of the drastic situation that we are all contributing to collectively. It is unfortunate that you are witnessing a time where the imbalance in the fashion industry is caused by fast fashion segment. The take, make, waste model adopted by fast fashion brands reeks of blatant disregard for a business's ecological footprint and brings forth their insatiable hunger to create value by producing and selling as many products as possible. So the Foundation's report suggests that between 2000 and 2015, clothing production doubled while utilization, which is the average number of times a garment is worn before it ceases to be used, decreased by 36%. Experts criticize this traditional linear model of development of raw materials into wearable or usable products until they are discarded with no regard for their negative impact on the climate. But even then, no affirmative action could actually change this model. That is until 2019. McKinsey and Business of Fashion, in their State of Fashion report, reported that COVID-19 and all that it came with impacted the fashion industry's profit margins massively, as it highlighted the fragility that the fashion industry's margins and the fashion industry's supply chains saw during the pandemic. The industry suffered a staggering 93% profit decline in 2020 as compared to 2019. And that started shifting the dialogue massively in the fashion industry in favor of adopting a different model. So the slow fashion movement comes to play. The slow fashion or sustainable or conscious fashion movement is an offshoot of such deliberations that took momentum after 2019. Unfortunately, most of these movements are being reduced to hashtags on social media, like it was noted in the plenary segment as well, in which packaging by fast fashion that appears to be consciously produced has been misleading people all over social media, mainly teenagers. Everyone using the social media gives their tacit consent to behavioral advertising by such portals, which results in regularly being inundated with constant suggestions to buy more fast fashion that looks like conscious fashion. The fundamental definition of what slow fashion has been is obscured by this kind of obscurity, and the positive impact of such initiatives on actual environmental sustainability is now highly contested. As the dialogue around the sustainability of the fashion industry gained momentum, a need emerged to bring in a more restorative approach. Doyens of concept of circular economy, the likes of our chair, Professor Bell, who are gracing the conference this year, would agree that no other model has its roots planted firmly in ecological, environment, and industrial economics as the circular economy does. For companies to successfully adopt circular business models, their revenue must first be decoupled from production and resource use. Currently, while they have great potential, these business models do not achieve this decoupling and the environmental benefits that come with it. This is largely due to the fact that at present, in most jurisdictions, the pace for combating the negative impact on environment is set solely by companies through voluntary actions. To achieve this decoupling and subsequent positive climate and social impact, it is imperative for governments to pick up the baton and draft specific regulations for the fashion industry. To take stock of the concerted efforts made by individual brands and retailers of the industry, we take a look at what's existing and how far can the industry go in terms of becoming sustainable. At an individual level, Maxine Beitat, a former international lawyer, wondered about the origin of her pair of jeans and traveled the globe to chart the path it took to reach her in the United States. She embraced the principle of circularity and started her own fashion brand, Zadie. Maxine also founded the think tank New Standard Institute that aims to make the fashion industry more sustainable, ethical, and equitable. A key player in the fashion industry, as you may all know, has adopted a modern version of circularity, one that has been a stalwart in giving customers an ultimate experience in second-hand products. I'm talking about Kering, and Francois-Henri Pinault, the chairman and CEO of Kering, poignantly notes that the division of responsibility is almost unfair in the fashion industry as it is skewed against the luxury fashion segment. Luxury fashion industry, big breaks individuals like Vivienne Westwood, Stella McCartney continue to take action to offset the negative climate and social impacts on their individual levels. But unfortunately, these stray individual efforts and voluntary actions, even though they are consistent, cannot do enough to make sure that the entire industry crosses the threshold to become a more sustainable one on the whole. Business of Fashion cooperated with the Sustainable Council and launched the Business of Fashion Sustainability Index with an aim to underline the sustainability gap. Further, the goal of sustainable consumption and production patterns. If you take a look at this year's report, you'll see that overall progress remained uneven, it remained opaque, and unfortunately, it remained too slow. While the index can provide some tangible standardized method of measuring the sustainability gap, it certainly cannot get the data that is required to get a clear picture, as it does not have any disclosure mandate backed by any government authority. It can only go so far in encouraging companies to move to a more circular economy. But the real work needs to be done by the governments to support such initiatives, to back such individual efforts, and to ensure that indexes like this get a clear-cut, honest data from companies. And that is what is going to ensure that the companies perform better and close the sustainability gap. The New York State legislative session this year closed with 3 fashion industry bills. One of them was the New York Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act, commonly monikered as the Fashion Act. It is currently referred to the Consumer Affairs and Protection Committee, which means that it is still a bill and it is not enacted as a legislation in the United States. This act attempts to impose social and environmental sustainability disclosure requirements on global fashion brands, making it a trailblazer of sorts in the industry. It is a one-of-its-kind legislation, which is an invitation to fight the climate crisis together by standardizing certain standards for companies across the board in their treatment of labor and the people who work for them. Sponsored by the state senator, Alessandra Biaggi, and Assemblywoman Anna Kels, and backed by a powerful coalition of nonprofits focusing on fashion and sustainability, this legislation will be imposing regularly the standards for maintaining sustainable practices to the companies that do a certain amount of business in New York. Imposing government regulation would regularize the reporting by these companies to the authorities. Here are the 5 major reporting requirements under the Fashion Act. The first one is the supply chain mapping. The Fashion Act would require companies to map a minimum of 50% of their supply chain across all production tiers. While the Fashion Act does not specify which 50% of the supply chain is subject to disclosure. It promotes good faith efforts that focus on those supply chains relevant to the prioritized risk. So in addition, companies must disclose the names of the prioritized suppliers. The second one is the due diligence disclosure. Annually, the company must publish a social and environment sustainability report that addresses the due diligence policies, processes, and activities conducted to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for potential environmental and social risks. The third is the impact disclosure, under which the companies must disclose their actual and potential negative environment and social impacts, including greenhouse gas reporting, impact on water, impact on chemical management, volume of production replaced with recyclable materials, and the monitoring and improving of their own labor conditions. The fourth is the impact reduction targets. Companies must meet and set annual targets to reduce their environmental footprint, specifically greenhouse gas emissions, including estimated timelines and quantifiable benchmarks for improvement. The most important of them all is the fact that all of the above disclosures must be made publicly available on the company's website. Even though the bill has not been passed to become law yet, this gives one a very fair idea of what to expect in the future. In the light of the above mentioned 5 major requirements, companies must be prepared to go above and beyond the internal regulators and examine the various verticals of their businesses to check implications after this enactment. They can begin by accurately tracing their supply chains across multiple jurisdictions and then conduct risk assessments to make appropriate disclosures in the future. At present, each company has its internal directives for disclosure, which in a sense means that all companies within the industry have the liberty to make their supply chains as transparent or as murky and opaque as to the consumers as possible. So whether the consumer can make an informed decision or not is in the hands of the companies to decide. The bill must now await the next session in January 2023, but lobbying to get them across the line in 2023 still continues. Regardless of the official enactment of this act or bill, sustainable legislations and regulations are pending worldwide. Fashion industry is feeling the teeth of regulations like these to this extent for the first time in history. And as the entire industry has been bereft of legislation, it is now time that we lobby for more such legislation. The framing and substantial backing of such legislation will serve as a touchstone for the jurisdictions to follow the global initiative to take on climate change head on. Before the Fashion Act, there was no comprehensive legislation that brought under its ambit such large multinationals together. They are global apparel brands, footwear companies, and luxury fashion brands that deal in other accessories. Accountability in disclosures is the very foundation of this legislation, and its implementation will be nothing short of a renaissance for the fashion industry. The lack of accountability, resistance to disclose environmental performance, and undertake supply chain due diligence is not limited just to the fast fashion segment. It also applies to the luxury fashion conglomerate. Along with the industry side, consumers also play a really important role in moving this needle forward. At first, it might not be too obvious to the consumer, but the public disclosure requirement will ultimately give the consumers the satisfaction that they are not being cheated or betrayed by the companies found in the violation of the law. When we speak about accountability and renaissance, we cannot just restrict ourselves to legislations like the Fashion Act and brands' ESG initiatives that they voluntarily undertake. The completion of the circle of collective accountability will be achieved only when we realize and recognize the importance of the role of a consumer who is a part of the attention economy today, one that is built on the shoulders of social media, which is in turn carrying targeted ads from the fashion industry to the consumers, like we mentioned before. Even the most conscious and most aware consumer is exposed to cues online that are being designed to encourage more consumption and in turn advocate a one-time use culture and a linear business model in a tacit way. Maxime Bida draws a very interesting parallel that I mentioned in my research about the story of decline of cigarette use. And she points out that what ultimately reduced cigarette use was the legislation on advertisements of cigarettes. So one was not exposed to the cues to buy more cigarettes. Similarly, for the reduction in consumption, it is imperative that every single aspect of consumption be brought under the purview of a broad legislation framework. Further, to promote increased circularity, policies that grant repair, reuse for organizations, even for the local consignment stores, policies about tax exemption, or those that mandate composting or waste management is another strong step forward through individual voluntary efforts. On the global level, fair labor standards will help rebalance the artificially low cost of new goods and further incentivize the circular, more equitable system. A single legislation that covers every issue and every part of a particular industry and pins accountability where it belongs actually does not exist. Therefore, a complete accountability renaissance is possible only when all aspects of the industry are factored in while drafting a particular legislation. While the Fashion Act might not touch upon many aspects of the industry that are still important to look into, it still is certainly the beacon to dawn a new era of accountability, as it is the first step in the right direction for the global fashion industry. This research has been an eye-opener on the subject of accountability, on how the impact of legislation can be a catalyst for driving organizational change, on bringing a renaissance to build a more accountable industry. To answer the question that was posted in the beginning of whether there is a need for harmonization of the international regulatory framework in the fashion industry for ensuring innovation in a way that it reduces the negative climate as well as social impact, we must adopt a holistic approach and view all elements involved in tandem, and not just the legislation in question. My study evaluates the Fashion Act from a multidimensional perspective, which can add richness and depth to organizational change studies going forward. In conclusions, this research gives us 6 major takeaways. The first, we can conclude that adopting of cutting-edge technology to help in innovation of renewable and reusable fibers for developing more sustainable products to achieve circularity is important. Further, in circular resale and rental business models, brands and solutions providers need to account for sold garments coming back into position so that they can be repaired, reused, and recycled. The future of technology in fashion, in this sense, would truly unify the industry around common practices that would make circularity more accessible to a common person. Second, since supply chains crisscross with each other across jurisdictions, only harmonization of legislation across the global industry can make it an appealing option for reluctant entrepreneurs at this point to be more proactive in taking their affirmative actions. Third, the harmonization of legislation has far-reaching consequences in making a positive social impact. Taking a leaf from the Fashion Act, the legislations which are built domestically will be developed in a way that they also have an international scope. For instance, when the enactment for Fashion Act comes into play, all companies to which the law will be binding will have to work towards monitoring and improving labor conditions, no matter where they are located in the supply chain. Regardless of how much this industry has created job opportunities in many jurisdictions, the pressure to meet fast fashion's deadline is leading women employees to be victims of gender violence, especially in Asian factories. So essentially, this harmonization will automatically lead to a reduction in exploitation of labor. It will lead to gender equality and also in improving poor sanitation conditions of labor in the industry globally. Fourth, building circular thinking into the very fabric of our collective society requires urgent lobbying for policies that facilitate a macro level shift from consumer-driven economy to a citizen-driven economy. Fifth, on a deeper level, the Fashion Act, while taking many multinational companies in its ambit, is also easing pressure on some companies that are spearheading the realm of sustainability already. In that sense, it does usher in an era of equality. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to end my presentation with this. The suggestion, all the suggestions that we've made through my research, all the conclusions that I've taken in the takeaways, pales in comparison to the final suggestion that I would like to make to usher in this new era of accountability. I would like to conclude by borrowing this profound thought from someone who has inhabited both the worlds of luxury and sustainability, fashion journalist Bandhana Tiwari, former editor-at-large for Vogue India, and sustainability activist in Bali, Indonesia. She advocates that fashion, consumption, politics, lobbying, and lawmaking can all find their teeth in the Gandhian philosophy. The accountability renaissance will be incomplete if it is not arising from a place of pure empathy. I have no doubt that there is no example in the history of politics that raises an analogy between politics and clothing the way Gandhian philosophy does. Connecting to a philosophy is critical to hold ourselves to responsibility, to adopt an ethical policy, and if we are to make the leap for fashion sustainability and take it from a dream to becoming a reality, there is no other way really other than to root the whole thing through ahimsa or non-violence and empathy for all, as suggested by Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you.